moment, we're just going to have uh, a very interesting, esoteric, theological conversation with some human elements, and we're going to see how it goes. So Jason, if you just want to say a few words.
Yeah, human elements. I'm just watching them pouring in. I'm hoping that they're all human, but that's probably optimistic. But at least some of them I recognize by their names, so you're probably human. Right. Well, those were a few words. I'm not very good at self-introductions. Can we just get the ball rolling in terms of our esoteric, very interesting discussion?
Okay, so for people who might know my weird poems about birds but don't know Jason, Jason is, I would say, one of the most important or foremost researchers in matters esoteric, spiritual, conspiratorial. He's tried to map hell. He's tried to think about Big Mother. We had an event in London a while ago where we launched Jason's book called Big Mother, which was thinking about the surveillance state, particularly in its feminized or quasi-feminist, feminized form. Um, though I think avoiding the blame game, right? Like the idea that this is somehow women's fault or men's fault or whatever. We're talking about completely different levels. This is like astral plane, cosmic levels of thinking about sexual difference and power. And Jason runs a great Substack called Children of Job, in which he has been, lately you've been reading a lot of Rudolf Steiner.
I have. Yeah, no, I'm disappointing some of my previous followers, if we can call them that, because now that I'm no longer mapping hell and fathoming God, I'm just not so bothered about these guilt by association. So Steiner has, yeah, people are very suspicious of Steiner because of his roots in the Theosophical Society, but I'm just ignoring that for now and just going to the source itself. And so I'm finding it very helpful. And as Nina knows, and all of my readers know, but maybe Nina's readers won't know, I'm very deeply interested in Christ and Christianity and the scripture, but I don't have much compatibility with Christian structures and organizations and doctrine and dogma. So Stein has just been very helpful in that regard, just as a countermeasure to the church frame. Like basically, I need to break out of that frame in order to be able to look at it. And he did that. He did that 100 years ago. He was very Christian, Christ-oriented, but entirely heretical. Pretty much everything he said was heretical, except a few things here and there.
Yeah, so we've had discussions before about the complexity and the problem of the institutionalization of Christ. I mean, I am a Christian. I go to church every week. I'm an Anglo-Catholic, which is a very weird fusion of things, um, but very wonderful from my point of view. Have wonderful priests, and I enjoy singing very much, and I like the liturgy and the ritual and reading of the gospel and so on and so forth. But I'm just trying to think about the kind of contemporary mapping of Christianity and interest in Christianity, because I'm also kind of very friends with a lot of people who are very interested in like the esoteric dimensions of Christianity, and that would perhaps include Jason, who are not so well. On the one hand, there are kind of more trad cath people who are nevertheless interested in the history of theurgy and magic and enchantment within the Catholic tradition. So people like Sebastian Morello would be key among this. I'm working with Brian Scarf on this project Soothsayer, which is also trying to look at some of those issues as well. Then you've got, I suppose, residual New Age people. There's a kind of, I don't know, rumbling on of a certain post-Christian spirituality type tradition. And then there are, I suppose, people who are taking Christ and Christianity seriously, but outside of the church or outside of the failings of the institution. Um, or are very suspicious of the institution, right? So someone like Steiner, you just mentioned, would obviously fit into perhaps that category. Someone who's very Christ oriented, but heretical from the standpoint of the organized church.
Yeah. He's pretty incompatible to a large degree, and, I mean, his point of view was that, um, understanding has been sacrificed really on the altar of faith, and that 'cause he's had the anthroposophy as spiritual science. So Steiner was claiming to have inside knowledge of the truths around Christ via his clairvoyant faculties and so-called Akashic records, things that is impossible to verify, and that I'm just generally skeptical of on principle, partly because they've been new ageified to the extent that they have. But, so that and then the only way to approach is just to go to the pudding, taste the pudding, and see if there's any proof in it. So, but to give an example, of Steiner in terms of how incompatible he is, his historical interpretation of Jesus of Nazareth is that there were 2 baby Jesuses, as described in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, hence the different genealogies and the different visitors, shepherds versus wise men or magi, different anyway, there's a number of differences in those gospels around the birth narrative. So Steiner had this very bizarre perspective that there are actually 2 babies born at a similar time to was anyway, I don't personally, I don't know what to make of that. I'm just giving it as an example that any Christian who wants to just stay more or less within the parameters of the faith and the dogma is just going to back away immediately from that. But to me, that's um, there's just no way to verify that, and I'm not sure how useful it is anyway. But another example then would be that Steiner talks about Jesus of Nazareth as Christophorus, which is the Christ bearer, and that the Jesus of Nazareth, at the baptism, that his I body, which is to say his conscious ego, departed, sacrificed itself, so to speak, left the body so that the Christ being who came from the Son could enter into the body of Jesus of Nazareth. And then the next 3 years were the period in which Jesus and Christ were fully fused. Now, that's got some overlaps with adoptionism, which is an early heresy which is in the New Testament. There's a number of passages which are adoptionist in the New Testament, and obviously the baptism by John is very key in all the synoptic gospels. Something happened there. So that's another example, unlike the 2 Jesus thing, that I find very useful and helpful, and that helps me to make sense of the Christology. But it's also not verifiable. But the thing about Christianity is that outside of a direct relationship with Jesus Christ, which I know is what it's all about, supposedly, um, none of it's really verifiable. I mean, one can check the scriptures and try and follow the history of the texts themselves and so on, but in terms of the theology, like your Nicene Creed that you recite, it's just something that was decided on at a certain point. So how do you check it? How
Yeah, but I mean, isn't that kind of question of like verifiability itself kind of inherited from a sort of Enlightenment scientific idea, right? Of what would constitute kind of proof and so on. Um, I don't know, Jason's frozen there. Oh dear, he's gone. All right, well you can have me witter on for 2 minutes and we'll see if Jason comes back. Um, yeah, so I suppose where I was gonna respond in relation to what Jason was just saying is this like question of what faith is and you know the invocation of whether we could verify the 2 Jesuses or any of the kind of heretical claims of adoptionism or indeed like whether the kind of dogma of the church would itself be subject to that kind of verification or ought to be. And I think the modern world has gotten extremely hung up on this very narrow way of determining things without necessarily questioning the metaphysical assumptions or presuppositions about not only what would count, but the way in which counting or proof becomes the frame itself. Um, and perhaps it's impossible to get back behind the question of belief as we understand it today as something justified, true, and something we could demonstrate, something we can prove, which is ultimately quite a sort of scientific or even scientistic understanding, um, and rather more to something that is um, less subject to those uh, kinds of principles. Um, that faith might look in other ways like perhaps something like a ritual or a series of rituals that might be inherited, that might be more matters of practice. Of course, the question still comes in of like, well, why these practices? Why these claims? And so on and so forth. But they certainly come from somewhere. Whether this is an idea of ritual as stemming from the relationship between people and the land, or from the kind of inherited ideas and traditions that have been accreted over time and so on. And I suppose, I mean, the reality of religious belief in the West, let me see if I can invite Jason back in. Um okay. Yeah, apologies. I haven't used this live stream before. Well, I've been on Jenny Holland's before, but I haven't run one before. So, and Jason is also living in the wilds of uh Galicia, I think, with some goats. So, hey,
Yeah, that was
I don't
hard.
know what happened there. Did the goats eat your cable?
I got bumped out. I don't know why. I mean, I'm not going to read anything into it, but I got bumped out. And I didn't get back. And somebody doesn't like me here. That's all.
Oh, don't be silly. Why take the paranoid reading? I refuse to take the paranoid reading of anything that happens to me, even the worst things. I think is a kind of like
But,
inverted narcissism.
well, yeah, it certainly is in this context. But if somebody, well, I won't use the real example because it might be too fraught. But if somebody is out to get you, it's good to be aware of it.
Yeah, but like even if they are out to get you, uh,
It's easy.
one ought one ought still not to be paranoid.
Well, that's why I call it paranoid awareness.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the timing is good because, yeah, I'm tired of mapping hell. I found the exit. I'm on the threshold of the exit, building my goat barn and stuff, popping in daily back into hell and saying, "Hey, look, there's other stuff going on out here." So, yeah, I'm confused in my own mind actually because I've made all these maps and I don't want to refer to them, anymore.
Well, I mean, it raises an interesting question about what a map is for, right? I mean, is a map to end something, right? Like a way of framing a vision, but once you've finished the map, you don't need it anymore in a certain
Absolutely.
sense.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so for me, it was I don't know if we've changed the subject too much, but maybe I think it will. I think it pertains to a lot of different things, including Christianity and faith. The mapping was to do with making sure I had my filters in place or my boundaries so I wouldn't get lured into these delusions and so on to the extent that I had been. And so, yeah, once I've developed them, I can start to let them down again, like with Steiner, where maybe it's iffy, and maybe I'm gonna end up falling into some traps I've been in before, but I'm gonna recognize them this time much more quickly, so I'm not too concerned.
Okay, so there's an optimism predicated on previous labor and suffering that gives you insight into
Absolutely.
what.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I while you were off there for a minute, I was wittering on in a spontaneous monologue about the different types of faith, right? Like, so what faith starts to become after a kind of scientific idea and understanding of proof, and how we can get behind or before a sort of idea of like countability or reason and that kind of thing. And whether it's possible to sort of imagine a type of faith which is not dependent upon those things we are disciplined by our historical inheritance to think would count as faith, right? Like to get behind that question in the first place.
What do you
Right.
mean,
Not
things that we think we would count on? Like, you mean ways of determining if something's true or not?
yeah.
Yeah, because I would take it further and say that can faith depend on not no particular beliefs? Can it be independent of cognitive belief entirely?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, then it might be something like an orientation or even a kind of practice, um, but one that is not conscious. Like, what would an unconscious ritual look like?
Exactly. I mean, that's when you went there, because that's exactly what I discovered in my own life, in my late mid-40s or something. I don't wanna give my whole timeline, take far too long, but there was definitely this transitional period that did come after, life beginning at 40 or life ending at 39, that had to do with recognizing the traps I'd fallen into around being a Gnostic or an occultist and all that stuff, and that did orientate me towards what I would now call as faith, but they largely had to do with materiality, with getting grounded, in a literal way. For example, I would intentionally inhibit my tendency in dreaming to fly upward and outward and into all these cosmic realms and start focusing on the body instead, going downward, downward, and, but that's the most literal thing, and then, uh organically things came into my path, such as house renovations, which led to running a thrift store, which then has led to, I mean, the latest one being the goat barn. So at a certain point in that trajectory, which I termed observing the law of matter, I began to understand that these were rituals I was engaged with. The house renovation was a very long 2 years or something ritual for purification of my body and restoration. It was a crack house, and my family is all alcoholics and junkies and all this stuff. So it was tailor-made by God. I can ignore that. Um, and so I did become conscious of it, but I didn't the thing is not to add anything onto it, just allow the consciousness to be there, so there's more appreciation and more, um, care. I'm taking more care in it because I realize it's more important than simply the externals.
Mhm. But if we go back to that question of, like, unconscious rituals that are potentially kinds of programs or potentially coercion. Right, because you said my Jason's books. So look,
I'm still here, just in case that happens again.
was that someone to complain about your goats eating
Actually,
the
it might have been. I think it's that they're doing a survey here, and they came around and knocked on my door to ask questions. I think that's what it is, 'cause that phone almost never rings. So I think it is the government on the phone, yes.
I'm sure it is. Um, so I was asking a slightly convoluted question about the just going back to the unconscious rituals, and I mean, I completely agree about the sort of embodied, like, central nervous system, what it means to come back into your body and that kind of thing, right? Like, whether it's uh, freely chosen or a matter of circumstance and so on, right? And I've definitely had years where I've had to do that because I've gone completely insane and and started dwelling in, like, you know, mad abstractions and fairyland and so on, right? And it takes quite a long time to come back down, and then do things like pray on your knees or go to yoga or go walking, uh, like to get back into the meat world.
Yeah,
Um, I was thinking about this, the unconscious rituals that may be sort of being programmed as children, obviously in the sense that, I mean, if we think about the role of ritual and tradition and the inherited transmission, well, of course, this could be go in any direction, right? It doesn't have to be bad. It could be like, well, here is a set of rituals and belief that have sustained our type of people for hundreds of years, and this is do and we're going to train you to do these things, right? But obviously in the West there's been a breakdown of that in terms of the Christian transmission as well as the pagan transmission. So what we have is a like transmission of, I don't know, uh, a sort of image of, well, being unconstrained in a certain sense.
true, true. But then that's intensifying the desire for a return to tradition, and I just think it's a trap personally. I mean, I think it's I mean, this is such a big subject, but I guess it is what we're here to talk about today. Um, so how to approach it. there's just a number of different angles because all I know for sure is what's for me, what seems to work for me. So um, I don't see a great deal of difference between occultism and Catholic ritual. I mean, essentially, a Catholic ritual. Oh my God, using a occult ritual. See, it's trying all my numbers now. Throw it out the window.
They're on, Jason. I don't know what is going.
They think I'm in demand or something. Um,
It's your agent saying, Jason, get off that live stream now.
yeah, get away from that Nazi.
You have no idea how funny it is. I mean, both funny and not funny to be constantly. Anyway, it's fine.
So I knew, I mean, really unprecedented. But anyway, we won't read anything into that.
I'm going to read absolutely everything into the fact that, like,
Oh,
somebody's got
they're not giving up either. You know, actually, just turn it off.
someone suggesting Jason should pay his rent. Yeah, I think that might be. Uh,
All right, I might try again. But
I think it's the Archons. They're trying to stop you from engaging in serious
oh,
spiritual dialogue.
it said no paranormal.
I know, but this is like there's a sort of paranoia which is like a joke that is lighthearted.
Well, yeah, of course, it has to be that. Otherwise, you just get self-important and ridiculous, like Alex Jones. Didn't mention names, should I? Right. Anyway, I remember where we were. If you do, uh,
Yep.
I have been. I've had an insight recently while finishing this book that I'm working on, and it's directly to this what we're talking about. That um, uh, so the rituals that I was engaged in with the house renovations and then the thrift store and currently with the vineyards and all that. So they're all about restoration, which is apokatastasis is the Greek word. It's in the book of Acts, and this is my kind of Christianity, which is fundamentally heretical. It's about the restoration of all things. Um, and so what's being restored? Well, in my own life, what's being restored, you could say it's the nervous system, you could say it's the life force, you could say it's the soul, like, there's different ways to describe it, but essentially it's going back to a time where something went terribly wrong and I got cut off from my life force, from God. I got separated from God. So I don't really believe in sin except as a symptom of trauma. I'd say that in the Adam's sin was essentially trauma, Lucifer's sin was essentially trauma. I know it's psychoanalytical language, but the word trauma is a very old word. Um, it's been co-opted now. So, so yeah, it occurred to me very recently that um, well, the crucifixion is this traumatic event that's imprinted the whole of humanity in our consciousness, and it's been carried 2,000 years through the churches, through the iconography, so that we've all been imprinted culturally with the image of the Christ event, which is this mass traumatic event, the death of a God, the death of a God. Yeah, well, that's exactly what it is, right? Um, and that's for our salvation. So how does that, what is that about? Well, because we have all been crucified in our way as children. We've all been persecuted, betrayed, tortured, and spiritually murdered. And so then it occurred to me that so that the church rituals are partially, they are an attempt that's partially successful to not re-traumatize, but reenact the original trauma so that we as participants, I don't go to church rituals, but I've been to them, can tune into our own trauma.
Okay. I mean, on the note of that word, what's the best way of, let's say, loosely defining the word trauma that avoids the kind of overcoding? Because obviously that word has, as you say, been kind of corrupted. Like, so is there a neutral definition that you use? Like maybe going back to the etymology.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I use it. I mean, I haven't incorporated it yet because I
Well,
still
you're using it
I
here.
use traumata because you just make it plural and then it's no longer, you know, familiar to the point of contempt. But schism, split, trauma means a split. So it's a wound. It's in the New Testament, but only as a reference to somebody who's wounded that gets healed, right? Uh, so yeah, the Greeks had the word trauma. It's just 150 years ago or so it started getting incorporated into the psychoanalytical language, which
Mhm.
was necessary breakthrough. It was profound, and also this is the same period that historically we started to become aware that children had feelings, that children were sentient. Because until 200 years ago, there was no consideration for children at all, really, in this sense that they could be traumatized in this very basic sense. So anyway, but a schism is a split, and so my thesis for it goes back to Prison of Infinity, but now is being updated in this new context. Is my wife used this phrase? It orphans us from the numinous. We become God's orphans. Of course, God isn't dead, but He's dead to us because we've lost all sense of Him. And then at a domestic or a social level, this relates to the absent father. No child gets traumatized e except for the absence of the father in some way, or the malevolent presence of the father. So it's very archetypal, isn't it? I mean, it's as above, so below.
So do you think, I mean, I tried to write about this in a slightly different register, like looking at the idea that we're post-patriarchy, which I guess is where you're coming from also in Big Mother. Um, but that like after the father, what happens to us? I mean, are we more traumatized in multiple different ways? You know, because without that kind of order and hierarchy, there's no place for the suffering to have meaning necessarily, right? I mean, if you have a system in which uh, birth, ritual, transmission, um, and all of those things are incorporated into something like a kind of hierarchy and an ordered meaning, right? Like whether it's rituals to mark like what entry into adolescence or just the acceptance of like a background level of suffering, right? Which at the well, you have to say Christianity acknowledges this, unlike liberalism, right? Unlike utilitarianism and all of those things. Um, that if you cannot make sense of trauma or multiple traumas, s some of which we all experience, right? If there's nowhere to put them, right, what happens to those wounds? And what does being orphaned actually mean in practice? Is it just chaos? Entropy?
I kinda lost the thread on that last thing. What was the last thing that you said?
Well, I suppose I was just trying to say about like without the kind of structuring of suffering and trauma, right? And it's being rendered meaningful. I mean, look, let's put it very bluntly. I mean, if you're a Christian, you accept that Christ died for your sins and that Christ died once for our sins, right? And that any of our suffering, which we will necessarily experience by virtue of being human, is in a sense meaningful in relation to Christ's suffering, but you are not Christ. Right, so you have a kind of hierarchical order of the meaning of suffering, and you have a system in which it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to ask about what happens in a kind of post-Christian world in which, on the one hand, let's say you have a kind of liberal terror of suffering, right? Like the idea that everyone just needs to avoid harm and be comfortable, and that the worst thing you can do is to upset someone, and that the sort of fantasy of the frictionless world. But on
Yeah.
the other hand, reality, the post-patriarchal world in which there is no order and hierarchy to the multiple
Yeah,
trauma.
I understand. I mean, you've got a big map there, but at the basic level, if you can't, I mean, one thing is it's clear is the difference between a child and an adult. Like a child can't make sense of the trauma, and it doesn't have a cognitive or an interpretive filter or mental apparatus in which to portion it out and understand it and deal with it. Just goes straight into the body, and that's fundamental to the trauma genetics of this, that an identity gets forged through the trauma at a formative age, which is configured against the awareness of the trauma to keep it out. Now then this leads to this unconscious, uh, reenactment compulsion, which is to unconsciously create the circumstances of the original trauma so that it can come back into consciousness and be reintegrated. So, uh, I'm not sure where I was going now. I mean, it's a very big subject. Uh, yeah, and it's
I
just
mean, that's all repetition compulsion, unless there is a cathartic element. I mean, again, to go back to Christianity, in that sense, of course, the ritual is repeated, right? The liturgy, you rehearse the crucifixion and communion over and over and over again, right? But it's one would say it's in order to sort of integrate it into a worldly mode of being and of being, right? That it's not the ritual for the ritual's sake, exactly.
well, I don't know. I mean, what do Christians how do obviously, it's gonna be different for all of them, but how do they approach the crucifixion or the rituals where they're remembering that Christ the Lord died for their sins and so on? It seems to me that the doctrine and the dogma around it doesn't really get to the quick of this. And I'm not sure that it's that different. I mean, we could say that this liberal progressive ideology that wants to avoid suffering, which is essentially to avoid the healing, because I guess that was my unfinished point, that you have to suffer in order to heal the trauma of the original suffering, because you have to reenact the circumstances. So if everything is geared towards avoiding suffering, you're still going to unconsciously reenact the thing, but you're just doing everything to just try and not experience it. Whereas in fact the only thing that works is surrendering to it, which is what the story of the crucifixion is about. But uh, it seems to me that it's not if we're very difficult, and maybe we'll get to the actual subject we thought we might talk about today, to separate organized Christianity and its theology and the dogma from liberal progressivism, because they're complementary. I mean, liberal progressivism, whatever you want to call that, the secular thing, it is what Christianity has evolved into socio-culturally and politically. And then by the same token, Christianity, in order to keep up, has adapted and adjusted. I don't think being Christian means that somebody just, um, it doesn't mean that they're more willing or able to accept suffering, really. I mean, they do have the idea. It's very important. I don't wanna understate it. It's indispensable to at least have the idea and the sense that suffering has meaning. But still, the whole idea of Christianity being organized for socio-political and cultural ends is always going to be geared towards reduction of suffering. All right, which that wouldn't be my first argument for why organized or social Christianity is anti-Christian, but you could throw that in there. I mean, maybe that is fundamental somehow, because it's a worldly orientation. It's exactly what when in the gospel when Jesus says to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan, because you value the things of men." That's precisely why he says it, because Peter says, "No, not you, Lord. Well, that can't happen. You can't suffer. You can't die." Peter cares about suffering and pain and worldly stuff.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I suppose one thing that comes to mind as you're speaking is the importance of, like, at Easter, the reenacting of the mob, right, by the congregation, right? So I think Christianity, like, full on confronts the idea that we killed God. Like, you are the crowd, right? You are the mob. You are the people who killed Christ, and that every one of us is through sin, through uh envy, through mimesis, um absolutely that person, right? So there is no salvation preempt preemptively, right, or anything like that. Like, you're always 1 minute away from, or 5 seconds away from being the mob. You know,
Yeah,
you
well,
are that.
that's the victim that becomes the victimizer, so that is
Yeah.
consistent with the trauma genetic framework. Exactly that. If we don't allow ourselves to suffer as adults in such a way that we consciously re-experience the trauma and heal and restore ourselves, our connection to God, we will always be one way or another in the role of the victimizer, even if it's self-victimization.
Right, and obviously we've seen the sense that I think the ideological significance of victimhood or being the victim is extremely dominant, right? You can accrue enormous social capital from such a thing, and there's been obviously a lot of black and white thinking that we see, like constant splitting, right? That oh, there are two types of people: there are good people and bad people, there are abusers and victims. There, are, whereas I think Christianity fundamentally recognizes that we are both all the time, right? And that you are constantly reminded of the fact, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That we are simultaneously capable of harming and being harmed, and this is what it means to be human, in fact.
Yes.
And I think that anthropology has been fractured, right, across a sort of moral, ideological plane, such that people, well, very much want to assume um, a purified position that avoids culpability in any sense.
Right. To be free of sin or without sin.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's true. That is in wokeism and all the rest of it. And somehow the biggest victim is the most free of sin. But it's as if they take that thing, he is without sin can cast the first stone, which obviously isn't what Jesus said. It was just a test. He didn't cast the stone. So but today's victim says, I'm a victim, therefore I can cast as many stones as I want to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the entire point of that parable, as you say, is that not that, oh, if I accrue enough moral credit, then I can like start throwing rocks at this fucking horrible.
When did this begin, though, in Christianity, you see? Because I'm just reading a book about, well, not about this, but about Bogomils as this little sect.
Oh yeah.
It's just bringing home to me how persecutory the church was from not from day one, but at least from day 300, what's it? But probably even within the 2nd century, it became persecutory. The idea of eternal damnation, which is not in the New Testament, not really. There's maybe one line in Revelation, and that's only for the devil. I mean, only bad enough if it's one, but still, uh, that is scapegoating damnation. It's dualistic. The whole idea of hell is dualistic. People try and say that Christianity isn't dualistic, but if you have hell, it is. If you have damnation, it is. And at least some of the texts in the New Testament, I'm thinking of Second Peter, they seem to be, and even Revelation, if it's read in a certain light, they seem to indicate very early church members, I mean, almost apostolic ones, but very close to that, complaining about heretics that they don't like and saying they're going to burn in hell. So then that whole idea of eternal punishment becomes about personal vengeance, or at least protection and defense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I mean, obviously you spent longer in hell and mapping hell and thinking about hell. Um, and, I have been reading Dante, I suppose, over the last few months with my friend Quentin, who might be watching this. Um, and yeah, to I suppose try to understand that as a spatial, conceptual, religious, um, I don't know, thing. Um,
But isn't it in Christianity, though? I mean, don't you find, as a Christian, that
I wonder.
you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, that there's a self-righteousness that tends to come with a Christian identification, that does have to do with, um, not necessarily condemning others, but certainly judging others as heretical or as non-Christian or as, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems, I mean, the very idea of heresy is that.
But I wonder if this is actually, I mean, this is certainly not my experience of going to church or the Christians I know. I mean, they would never speak like this. My priest would never talk in this way. There is no, I mean, some people might think this is part of the problem, like the church has lost its bulls or something, but actually, there's very little condemnation or judgment, and no one would ever accuse someone else of being a heretic. I mean, I think there is sort of structural criticism of the modern world, right?
Mm.
And its various traps and lures, right? But
Yeah.
but it's not straightforwardly anything like, well, these other people, because of what they do, are going to hell, and we should feel happy and smug because we're not. Like, I have never heard a sermon in which this is presented in this way. I mean, I don't, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I've ever heard hell really mentioned in my church.
Well, no, it's probably politically incorrect. So, I mean, it would be hard to separate, as you just mentioned, a genuinely Christian attitude of universalism, let's say, Catholicism, from this kind of lack of cojones, from just not wanting to offend people and not wanting to put people off, right? Because I mean, it's very obvious. It's become very obvious how off-putting it is if you're just going to bang on about hell and heresies and stuff the whole time. But yeah, so that's this curious conundrum or paradox, because I also agree with Kierkegaard that being a Christian became too easy. It is supposed to be very demanding, but I think, well, one of the keys for me is it's not about cognitive demands. It's not like, can you stretch um the parameters of your logical thinking almost to breaking point, into believing things that just don't make sense. That's not, I mean, that is hard to do, but I don't think that that's particularly valid to do that. It's to do with something else. It's to do, I think the fundamental is can you recognize that you are, well, a sinner in the language, but that you are inadequate, you are insufficient, you cannot resolve your own trauma, you cannot save yourself, you cannot control your life, you can't do diddly without God.
Mhm.
Right. So and that's very, but that's become, it seems to it's lost its meaning for people. Like, I find it difficult to talk in that language because so many people have talked in that language, and, well, they mean different things, and in the end, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean to surrender to God? Exactly. I had a recent insight for myself, because I've always had this strong resistance to the word obedience and the idea of obedience. But it occurred to me, well, listen to your intuition, trust it, and follow it. Which of course you can be fooled, but let's say if it is true intuition, that's coming from God. That is obedience. Well, that is absolutely how I've attempted to live my life, probably for 40 years or something or more, but I definitely got it wrong quite a lot, because I hacked into my own intuitive faculties with psychedelics and things like that. So I got a lot of entities mixed up in there which aren't God. But I do think human beings are born with an innate faculty of the spirit to connect to God through what we call the intuition, and that if you follow that, you're doing God's will. So if you want to call that obedience, fine, but it's proactive, self-initiating obedience. It's it's not heretical per se, because if you're obeying God, it can't be heresy, but it's always willing to be heretical, because you can't pick up your Bible every time you have an intuition and check, wait, did Paul say this or did he say that? You follow it. You follow it, and you make loads of mistakes. And in my case, as you know, that did include some humdingers, you know?
But, I mean, presumably you learnt some things through your journeys through the infinite and
Well,
the
that's
void.
right. I mean, that's the bottom line for me, is that, I mean, well, this we could bring back to trauma. I don't know if we want to, but if whatever traumata we're carrying in our lives, it drives us into these pathological behaviors one way or another. You can call them stupid or clumsy, as words that you've used, but I think they're definitely potentially pathological, destructive and self-destructive. But as the William Blake thing, if you persist in your folly, you become wise. If we start to become conscious of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and we end up inviting or entering into or creating circumstances semi-conscious in which we will reenact the trauma in a way that is, well, really profound and I mean, it's just like being re-traumatized almost, except it's not really re-traumatizing. But anyway, then the trauma that has cut us off from God becomes the trauma that reconnects us to God. So we've transformed our folly into wisdom. And this is in some of the Bible stories. It
Mhm.
is. So you do it all wrong, and it turns out that that was the right way because God is looking for independent agents. This whole thing about free will, somebody's put it in the chat. Well, does if sin comes from trauma, does that mean you have does that hijack free will? Well, yes, it does, but that's the whole point. Sin is acting without free will. If we have free will, we're acting in God or with God or for God. There is no sin. That's the only way to be without sin. This is why there's this contradiction in the idea of hell, because no one would ever act in a way they'd end up in hell except that they don't have free will, that they're locked into some compulsive reactive thing. So 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 the hell is about purging, it's the reenactment. Hell is we create a chamber for seemingly potentially eternal reenactment of the trauma. But of course it's nothing is eternal except God. Eventually you get it. Eventually, if you reenact it enough times, the penny's gonna drop. You might die before that happens.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think hell is something like machinic repetition or something like that, right? It's like addiction is hell or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, I suppose maybe the question comes in here around sin and free will is that it is perhaps something like temptation, right? Like if we are, I don't know, a bad idea occurs to us. Oh, I could do this and not do that. Or oh, what if I did that? Maybe, I'm bored, I'm curious, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, okay, well, A, where is that voice coming from? If it's not coming from our intuition and God consciousness or whatever you want to call it, right? It's coming from somewhere else. And B, I suppose the part of the desire to respond to the temptation is the idea that we are choosing to do the thing, right? And that's what looks like free will to us, no?
Yeah, so it has to be a spectrum. It can't be a polarity of predetermined, and then freedom, like boom. There's a spectrum that we're on. I've understood this spectrum, um, in terms simply of awareness. If we have an this kind of tiny margin of free will in which we could choose to be aware of what we're doing or not, and the more we use that free will to actually be aware of what we're doing, I victimizing ourselves and others, and reenacting traumas. Again, it's like bringing consciousness to the reenactment, then our behavior does transmute over time. But it's not like this one moment where you say, "That's it, I'll never drink again." I mean, obviously, we have those moments, but the transformation doesn't happen because you make a decision like that.
Yeah, no, sure. I think then you have to kind of practice a whole set of structures such that you are the kind of person who doesn't do that anymore, right?
Right,
And
but
that
then there's the dry drunk. Then there's a problem with the dry drunk, and you can be imprisoned by the law, like Paul. That's so essential to
yeah,
the Pauline thing is the law is sin. If you obey the law 100%, you're still sinning because you're doing it for the wrong reasons. That's not what God's looking for anymore.
yeah, for sure. And I think there are many, many stories in the Bible in which it's always the wayward son or the person who is done made many mistakes who is the most beloved, if you like, right? Not the person who's kind of followed the rules and done what you were supposed to do according to familial or societal norms, right?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of calling, instead of Christian, I was thinking of wayfarer, which I think has been used because it's the way, but now you've come up with a better term, say we're the wayward.
The wayward, exactly. But yeah, just I wanted to say something quickly on the free will mapping point because, I mean, if you read Spinoza's Ethics, I mean, he has this very very interesting approach, which is to say that well, there is determinism. In fact, everything is kind of determined. It's unfolding as it was supposed to be, and all we can do as modes of as like fragments of God is get better at mapping causes in a certain sense, right? So if we repeat destructive behavior, right? The reason why we keep repeating the wrong thing is because we haven't understood the cause correctly, right? We can't work out what the connection between one thing and another is.
Yeah.
Um, and if we can start mapping causes, then we get closer to what he calls the third kind of knowledge, which is like knowledge of the mind of God, right? We can map like God, right? And obviously then the question of like Deus sive natura, like God is nature, um,
Who's
is
this
very
again? Sorry, who's this?
Spinoza, right?
Right.
Who was a heretic, right?
But wasn't he pantheistic, Spinoza?
Yeah. I mean, there's one way of reading him, yeah. There's a sort of pantheist or
Well,
even panentheist.
ironically, that's very different. I think Steiner was that. Ironically, I mean, I would never want to use the word heresy, but the idea of mapping hell I would be tempted to say that that's like a real heresy, not because God's going to punish you, although he could say, nothing makes God laugh harder than man's plans kind of idea, but that um, it just seems the one sure way that we're going to lose the spirit. Well, I suppose there's more than one, but it's one of the one sure ways is if we think that we can map it and turn it into a formula or a technique or again back to or maybe back to my objection to Christian rituals. Never mind organizations and structures and stuff. This whole idea of turning the Holy Spirit, which seems to me that that's the living principle in our lives that we could say is always available in this way, that equally to everybody, the Holy Spirit, potentially. If we try to turn that into something that isn't spontaneous and unexpected and surprising, then I don't think it's blaspheming against it. I just think we're closing the our access to it.
But I don't think they're sort of incompatible, right? So, I mean, if you think about like prayer and contemplation or singing in church or repeating various prayers collectively or performing the peace, are these not also like types of preparation, right? Like they're forms of disciplining that precisely allow you perhaps to be open to
I
the
suppose.
spirit.
I mean, would you do Vipassana, for example?
Yeah, I'd be up for that.
Yeah, I probably would be too. I haven't done it. So, but you wouldn't think it was Christian. Yeah, it's
No,
obviously not Christian, it's Buddhist. So I guess that's a distinction as in you don't mistake the menu for the meal. Sure, why couldn't Catholic rituals work in the same way that Vipassana or yoga, right? But generally speaking, that's not the viewpoint of kosher Christians. It's like that this actually is the thing. This is the body of Christ in the wafer, etc., etc.
no, sure, but again, I'm not necessarily sure, at least from my point of view, that they're incompatible. I mean, as far as I understand, this Vipassana, it involves um, being silent for a few days in a sort of sanctuary type place, right?
Yeah, and sitting without moving. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, And yeah, I mean, I do go to yoga. I do I do things like this, which certainly it's true that some Christians wouldn't do because they think it's part of another ritual practice.
Yeah.
I mean, the more interesting question for me is there a hidden or a esoteric Christian physical ritual practice that
Mhm.
goes beyond the postures that one takes in a service, right? Like this, I'm sure, I'm convinced that there is some like hidden Christian physical set of exercises.
Yeah, well, Steiner's the guy then, because he talked about that. It's in his books, whether it's still valid now. Um,
Who's talked about this?
Steiner
Oh, Steiner talks about it, yeah.
talks about Christian initiation. I mean,
But I
that
mean, like,
is
literally mean like a set of exercises, like 50
well,
Christian exercises,
he does give exercises,
like
actually.
jumping jacks, something.
Well, it's not I mean, I don't know how they are physical, but I don't know how exact moves and stuff, but, um, yeah, but I don't know. I mean, there isn't the principle that we make ourselves available to God and then God moves. Like, it's God has to make the move, isn't it? We make ourselves available in some way. So to me, it's to do I think there is some Eastern Orthodox tradition here with catharsis, purification for illumination for theosis, but I talked about this on tomorrow's podcast actually, but, it seems to do largely with purification, which is to do with letting go of bad habits, which is
Yeah.
to do with emptying out, essentially emptying out all the stuff that's been put in us by the devil slash trauma slash bad habits that I don't know if I
Slash newsagent.
yeah. So, but I mean, that I don't know. I mean, part of it is accepting it as well, because there are people who are gung ho for purity and well, they're not very healthy as a result of it.
Yeah, I mean, like last Lent, I did a fairly strict, well, pretty strict Orthodox diet that was no meat, no fish, no eggs, no dairy, no oil. So you're basically just eating like bread, honey, vegetables, and fruit. And that was pretty great, to be honest. It made everything taste unbelievably delicious because, like, your diet is so restricted. Like, I had a fig one morning, and it was like the most delicious thing I've ever tasted. And I was like, "Oh, so this is how." Like, we have these ideas of like ambrosia and so on. It's like because obviously if you sensorily deprive yourself like for a period of time, then the most minimal thing, like the I don't know, the smell of a daffodil or something becomes, like, unbelievably powerful, right? So your senses are kind of reset.
Yeah. I had a dream a few weeks ago that every object filled me with joy. Every object I looked at and encountered, I just felt absolute joy. And strangely, a few days later, I was reading Brothers Karamazov, a Dostoevsky thing, and he had Father Zosima talks about that, take joy in every object. So it was a weird sort of echo of that. But now it's become a point of contrast, as in mostly my day is getting annoyed with objects for not doing what I want, and so now I just try to remember what it could be like, Jason, what it probably was once like when you were a little baby, just everything is filled with God.
Yes, I mean, I always like those stories about intentional communities where they have like a cup, and the cup has a name, and the cup is a sort of intentional convivial object, and then if the cup breaks, it sort of dies, and then you like have a ritual for like Bob the cup, and like everything is sort of re-enchanted. But because precisely it's the object itself is meaningful, right? In the context of this community, right?
Yeah.
Because the object is something that is imbued with a collective spirit and, gratitude. Like I'm quite grateful to this cup. Why
Well,
not?
so I mean, there's 2 extremes here, and somehow the middle way it needs to incorporate both rather than actually losing both of them, because there's this which is like being a baby, which I think can become a bit just impractical, if not kind of cheesy new age if it gets too ritualistic. Um, and then there's just getting on with one's life and doing what God wants us to do and not trying to imbue it, not trying to re-enchant it. So one is like being hyper conscious to make up for our lack of consciousness, and the other is, I guess it has to do something to do with just not being self-conscious, like just being an instrument of God that gets things done, like the carry water, chop wood principle. I don't think those whatever they were, the Taoists carrying their water and chopping their wood were thinking about the sublimeness of water and wood. It's the whole point of that is that they're just living a completely ordinary life. So, like I mean, building this barn, I've been cutting down birch trees, and I don't say a prayer for those birch trees. I'm quite ruthless, really. I just chop them down and drag them where I'm going. And I'm not sure. Like sometimes I think, well, I'm just being negligent. and it's just, brutal, just like, not insufficiently conscious, but sometimes I think, well, if I'm in harmony with my body and with nature, then I don't have to add the conscious intent to it because it's all part of the I'm just part of the earth too. I'm just the human part that's doing this thing with the tree part for the goat part, and so, yeah. I mean, I seem to be more orienting towards this kind of, uh, much more mundane and practical approach to life, where I only really think about Jesus and Christ and this if I'm reading about it, if I'm talking with somebody, but otherwise it's just get on with the things that need to be done. Now, 'cause one has to create the circumstances and the environment in which most of the things that need to be done are wholesome and good, like a vineyard and a barn and goats and things like that. We definitely and of course, I spend a lot of time on the internet, which isn't like that. But then that's another point, is we are in this particular phase in history where I wanna say that most people seem almost lost really, or more than almost, but they seem almost beyond saving in some way, and I don't wanna say it so bluntly because I don't know what that means exactly, but I do feel that we're in a time in which we're being lured collectively into something that is, uh, very far from God.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe I'm kind of delusional or just optimistic in some sort of contrarian way, but I wonder about that. I don't know. I have some great faith in people and people's awareness and understanding somehow. I think, well, if you, as you say, if we have this sort of intuition and this capacity to sort of comprehend God's will, however imperfectly, and we're constantly battling it with our own, and we're working out how to, um, I don't know, yeah, not fall into the pits of hell, but probably doing so anyway. And if everybody is in that sort of situation, then everybody has the means to understand that. And
Well, they might have it internally, as in everyone's got some connection. I have the sense that hell, and I got a hostile comment, by the way, in there for dissing hell, but it distracted me a bit, but you can read it later. But I have the sense, I mean, I even had this dream one time that hell is something that we engineer. A human being we are capable as human beings of engineering hell, and even perhaps, even an afterlife hell wouldn't be eternal because it's constructed still by human consciousness, but nonetheless, it could be, it would definitely be a place you wouldn't wanna end up. We might all have to for a time. Uh, but if you'll keep it to this world, um, as I said, my mapping hell, I don't refer to those maps so much these days because I'm feeling much more optimistic in my own life, but I'm not going to throw out all that evidence. It is a body of evidence, and it is the evidence that collectively we have been socially engineering hell for hundreds of years, and I don't see that that's changed direction, and it certainly hasn't slowed down. My wife's optimistic because she believes in peak oil, and it's all going to fall apart because the oil's going to run out. Well, she may be right, but in the meantime. Um, it seems that people are the technology, I think, is even though we're using it now, so it has its benefits and maybe if we use it wisely enough, we can counteract the deficits of it. Um, I think insofar as people are becoming more and more lured into technology and more dependent on technology and more sort of existing through technology, to me, that is inherently anti-natural. I feel, even though I know you can make a sophisticated argument that it's part of nature and so on, but I guess it become fundamentally, uh, I'm not sure if I wanna say this, but this Satan idea, it seems to me it is more than just a human like Girard, René Girard, I think, would just say that Satan is the tendency towards violence and scapegoating in human beings. He makes it anthropological, really, whereas Steiner makes it anthroposophical, and he talks about Ahriman as an actual, you know, being that is really just trying to ruin everything. Um, and so I do hold a space for that. You know, I would rather not really, because Lucifer, like when you were talking earlier about going completely insane, I was going to interrupt you there because I'm sure you didn't make it all the way to insane, but the way that you described it, that's the way that Steiner talks about Lucifer, and that was my experience in my 30s when I was consciously invoking Lucifer and working with Lucifer. At whatever level of consciousness I was at, I did go half insane and did all kinds of things that proved it to myself enough. But anyway, I don't know. I just get the feeling that things are a lot worse than most people realize in this regard, and that I mean, if we want to put it in this context of a social political Christianity, this is part of the basis of my pessimism about this, is that um, I think it's part of the architecture of hell, really. I think it's just going to propagate hell. I don't think it's going to bring people out of it.
What is going to propagate how?
Having Christian nationalism or turning Christianity or reintroducing Christianity into the political realm or trying to fuse church with state or however it's going to actually proceed. It might keep Islam at bay, but as, you know, whatever.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to for anyone listening, our original part of our original idea was to talk about political theology with reference to Carl Schmitt, and um, I suppose the question or the idea that uh, liberal political theory and liberal politics is, if you like, a secularization of theological ideas, right? That fundamentally those secular political systems that think of themselves as enlightened, rational, and so on are um, remain deeply theological, right? In a certain sense. I mean, that's putting it very bluntly, I suppose. I mean, I was going to read the sort of opening quote from the chapter in political theology from 1922. I'll just read a couple of lines. So Carl Schmitt writes, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. The exception in jurisprudence is analogous to the miracle and miracle in theology, and so on and so forth, right? So Schmitt is not the only person to have made this observation or this argument, but it's quite a significant uh, contribution, right, to unpicking, particularly, I would say, political theory, right, which often takes as its starting point the kind of post-Christian or post-theological idea that there is something just uh, practical and human and material about all of our thinking about the state, right? I mean, I fundamentally think that human beings are religious and cultic, and that liberalism and capitalism are no exceptions to this. And in fact, that what's the only thing that's kind of possibly slightly interesting about liberalism and capitalism is that they pretend that they're not religious when they blatantly are. I mean, I don't even think that makes them interesting. I think that makes them kind of delusional. But um, so I suppose, in some sense, that all politics is political theology. I guess that would be the proposition, right? On the one hand, the second point that I think Jason is making about how to put it, like what would be the resurgence of theology in politics, right? So if you're talking about Christian nationalism and Christianity, unlike Islam, is different, right? Because it carves out a separation between the religious and the secular, or the sacred and the profane, and so on, right? It's not a full bore. I mean, Islam, in a sense, is political theology in the sense that there's no difference between the politics and the theology, right? Like, it is just one thing, right? It's Sharia law, it's God's will on earth, it's it's conquering, and so on and so forth, right? Whereas Christianity, for a whole series of reasons, ends up kind of carving out space, right? So and that the secular and the profane and the religious and the state are kind of perhaps through artificial divisions, but nevertheless sort of separated in certain sense. So, I mean, if you live in a liberal secular country, you do not have to be Christian, and certainly you will not be punished as an infidel or a heretic if you are not Christian. In fact, probably the vast majority of people at this point, or a majority, might say that they are vaguely Christian, but they're not practicing in any way. And a lot of people would say that they were atheist or agnostic. And there's no punishment for this whatsoever,
Yeah,
right? Because Christianity is not a matter of conforming to the law in this sense.
yeah. So, I mean, I find it very hard to think about this stuff, but it doesn't stop me trying. Uh, and I don't, as Nina knows anyway, I don't have any kind of political affiliations or interest. I've never had any faith in political solutions, political ideologies, partly because of my background. Um, but on the other hand, we can't avoid it, as it's cliche. I mean, everything is political. We are part of communities and so on and so forth. Uh, so, I mean, what I would say anyway, whether it's going to be coherent, is that, as I said earlier, like our political system, democracy, let's keep it simple, democracy and liberalism, and just some of these basic things that we associate with the West for the last 100 years or more, uh, they have evolved out of Christianity, which I guess is part of the Schmidt's point. Um, Therefore, I would say an atheistic or a secular state, uh, because it is Christian and because it's the latest iteration, this is the course that we're on politically. Now, I don't think it's a good course, but I'm not involved in it. I mean, I get involved in local politics if it was small enough and local enough. Like, I voted for my mayor in Hope. He didn't get in because there's only 5,000 people, and I knew him personally. But beyond that, I'm just not. I think this is part of the lure of the technology, is to get us to think that we can think globally or even nationally. Is beyond our real faculty to think about. So yeah, I just don't have a stake in the game in terms of where the politics are evolving. Uh, but I assume they're evolving somewhere. I just assume we're part of some organism and things are evolving. And well, at the highest level, it is in God's hands. It's also in Satan's hands, but for me, Satan works for God, and he's given the reign here, and so it's all a test, I guess. If I crunch it down to a really simple formula, we're being tested. So whether we will take the mark of the beast, figuratively, literally, symbolically, etc. And so what is taking the mark of the beast then? Well, to me, the thinnest end of the wedge is participate, like back to Peter and Jesus, "Get thee behind me, Satan," is participating in worldly values any more than we need to. As in
Right.
believing that we need to make the world a better place, or that somehow being a Christian or getting closer to Christ or God depends on some sort of social reform or any of that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a very really difficult question. I mean, obviously, like, the people will recite these sort of Christian ideas of, like, um, of the world but not in the world, or whatever. Like, this kind of complicated question about how much.
The other way around, by the
Yeah,
way.
in the world, not of the world. Yeah, I know. Sorry, it's like 9,000 degrees here. I'm like, my brain is melting. Yeah, exactly. Whatever Jason said, but and I do have Christian friends who say that they would never have anything to do with politics because this would take them away from their Christianity, and their commitment is to Christ, not to the world, and that kind of thing, right? So, on the other hand, if you're confronted by a system which is increasingly openly, actively Christian, right? But because partly it's forgotten its historical debt to Christianity, or perhaps it's a Christian heresy, or perhaps it's an inversion of Christianity, whatever. I mean, there's a real material sense in which Christian practice and Christians are being kind of persecuted by defenders of the progressive regime, right? Like everything down to praying outside of abortion clinics or whatever. You know, Christianity is fair game, right? And in fact, Christianity is often targeted for various reasons. Oh, it's repressive, it's homophobic, it's whatever, blah blah blah. Um, so I suppose there is a point about at which one's faith, you know, and why would it be easier? I mean, the Bible repeatedly says it will be difficult, like you say. I mean, that you will be persecuted for your faith and so on and so forth. In fact, this is you one ought to expect this. Um, and perhaps providence will, in the end, you know, all of this will have a kind of meaning. I mean, this was de Maistre's problem after the French Revolution, right? How could God allow the French Revolution to destroy the monarchy and the church, right? Like, what's the higher meaning of these kind of satanic, demonic eruptions? Like, how can we fit them back into a kind of course of understanding? Um, I mean, nevertheless, I mean, like Christians are being slaughtered en masse in parts of the world by Muslims in Sudan and elsewhere. We presumably don't want to simply say, well, this is all part of God's plan. I mean, do we not want to defend something like the Christian West or the West's Christian inheritance without becoming ridiculously vulgar and
Oh,
about
it's
it?
an important question, needless to say, and you're in Britain as well, so it's much more palpable. This came up in the Andrew Wilson conversation I listened to. He is a Christian nationalist, and he brought up this question. He's talking about the normative principle, that churches have to have a normative principle. You have to be able to say what's heretical and what not, which obviously I fundamentally disagree with, particularly because they get it wrong. In my opinion, they haven't even done enough study about it. But anyway, leaving that aside, the example that they brought up was, can a Christian defend himself? And the Protestant and the Eastern Orthodox agreed, yes, he can. And why? Well, because there's a passage in there which Jesus says, go get your sword, even though who knows what that is even doing in there. Maybe it's symbolic. And then later he says, he who will live by the sword will die by the sword, not to mention resist not evil, not to mention love thine enemies. Like, there's so much in in the gospel, maybe not so much in Paul, but certainly in the gospel, that is anti-violence, is to say no to violence. I'm quite Girardian, as you know. I find Girard as one of the most insightful thinkers, if not the most, of the 20th century around Christianity. Um, and he brought it down to this. This is the fundamental lesson or meaning of the gospel, is non-violence, non-scapegoating, and that the only way to take the Christ position is to be willing to be crucified, and basically that means you will get crucified, to not be part of the mob, as you were saying earlier about that the ritual where we recognise that we're always part of the mob, and that it will never be, obviously it will never be easy, but there will never be a time where we won't feel that the violence is justified. It will to give up violence. It will have to be in a moment where we feel absolutely justified, because that's the nature of scapegoating. Is the person who's using the violence always feels that, well, I didn't start it. I'm just defending it. So the only way to stop the cycle repeating and leading to the apocalypse, the war of all against all, is actually to put down the sword when the sword is coming at you, when somebody's coming at you with a sword. Uh, so
Yeah,
so so yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to get on a platform and preach that to a bunch of Christian nationalists. It would be futile, and I can't say I would even practice that if somebody came wanting to kill my goats or something. I'm just saying that that is the Christ way as I understand it, and the context for it is valuing the things of God, not the things of men, valuing the life of the soul. Like, better to lose a limb in this life than to be cast into Gehenna's valley fire, whatever, for, with all your limbs intact. That understanding that there's something else going on here, not just later when we die, but right here in the lived moment that isn't even material, never mind political. I mean, politics is a layer on top of society, which is a layer on top of nature, which is a layer on top of the spiritual, we could say. So, um, that seems to me the fundamental challenge of faith is, can we tune in, like poor old Job, more and more to the spiritual dimensions where no matter how horrific our physical, our social circumstances are, we're okay. We're more than okay because we feel God's presence. So that wouldn't, the thing is you can't be fighting to protect England and have that experience. You can't, because your nervous system's gonna be jacked up and you right? You need I'm not saying that this is for everyone. Maybe we need some people to sacrifice themselves, as in the olden times, and they're the knights, so the monks can live long enough. I don't know. Maybe this isn't for everybody. So I don't have a political position on it, except I'm just saying it's not Christian. Christian nationalism is not Christianity, right? Violence is never Christian.
Well, what about, I mean, I suppose thinking about the decisions that appear to be made by people who have the power to make those decisions that are not seemingly in line with the will of the people or in the interests of the people, right? Like there is a people that have lived on this island for a long time. They want certain things. There is maybe something like a national interest, and the people who govern us are making decisions that are seemingly inverted or opposite to that, right? And lots of people will use the language of treason, right? That we're being run by a cabal of our enemies,
Yeah.
who have some other series of end goals, right, which are not in alignment with what the vast majority of people want. I mean, what do the vast majority of people want? They want to live meaningfully, safely, have a family, perhaps, a meaningful job, protect where they live. I mean, these are very simple things, right? But what else is there in a certain sense, right?
Yeah.
To be able to practice a religion if they have one, to enjoy a creative and interesting mental life. But people increasingly cannot do these things. I mean, the nation might be a way of organizing. I mean, Britain is a Christian country, right? It was a pagan country. It was a Christian country. It is a post-Christian country that owes many of its liberal values to Christianity,
Yeah.
however impacted they might be,
Yeah.
right? It is not a Muslim country or any other kind of country. Like that's what it is.
Yeah, well, it's nominally Christian. I mean, really saying that Christianity has never been Christian, essentially, but I don't mind. I'm willing to concede that a nominally Christian government or social system or culture is better than others, and certainly it's the one that, yeah, is natural to Britain at this point, and therefore definitely better than Islam, objectively and subjectively, etc., etc. Right, I'm willing to concede all of those things, uh, but, uh, can we go back in time? Number 1. I mean, maybe this is all part of God's plan, essentially. I know that can just be a really lazy thinking fallback, but you also can't just rule it out. Maybe this is part of God's plan to bring, like it's a selection process or something. Um, and, well, I guess, I mean, I don't wanna repeat what I was saying before, but I suppose the middle consideration is, what do people need collectively and individually in order to have enough space in which that they can start to reconnect to their life force and to their souls and heal their trauma and really become true Christians, true Christ-oriented individual beings? Like, it's gonna be hard if there's civil war and if there's rule of Sharia and all this stuff. It's gonna be hard. but they haven't been doing it in the last few hundred years either. So I can't be sure that a real crisis isn't going to help some people. It might help some people, and it might be that the people it doesn't help are complacent anyway, or they were until they started to lose. It's very difficult when we're talking about large groups of population, large populations. I mean, I don't have a sort of feeling of loyalty. So it's ironic because my wife is much more concerned about this than I am. She keeps talking about what you're talking about with Islam and all that, and of course, because it could come to Spain too, but more about Britain. And see, when I was 20, I thought I was living in the end times and I was going to see the apocalypse, and everything was going to come to an apocalyptic end, and then it would be the kingdom of God would come after that. I was looking forward to it. So I've always had this context for. I don't believe that now. I think that things might get apocalyptic in a socio-political sense, as in just be really, really violent and destructive and horrible, but I don't know about the kingdom of God. I think that's gonna take a lot more at this point. So I'm not looking forward to the apocalypse anymore, but nonetheless, I don't see any way around it, as in a socio-political apocalypse. I don't see that we can just create some quasi-utopia and then prepare for the second coming or something like that because we're all loyal Christians, who've built a state that represents Christ, that just doesn't
Yeah, I
seem
mean, I don't think Christians are I don't know, compelled or instructed to actively bring about the end of the world or indeed desire to wait for it. On the contrary, like one must not do that. One must be prepared, but not, it's not like anyone's going to tell you or something like that, right? You shouldn't be spending your entire life just like waiting for the.
well, no, but also not supposed I don't think you're supposed to be or generally consider that you're supposed to be, as Christians, building Christ's kingdom, right? That's not for humans to do either, is it? So then what is it? I mean, there are passages that obviously are very contentious these days, and I would agree. I mean, I find them contentious too in and Second Peter again, which is basically saying do what the government says and don't say anything bad about the government. That's Second Peter. You're not even allowed to criticise the powers that be. Well, obviously that's going way too far for me. But the idea of in Paul of just accepting that you're under these powers because God put them there, well, is that contradict you with Satan as the prince of this world or the ruler of this aeon? Not necessarily if God put Satan there. So then it does seem to be, yeah, accept these illegitimate rulers because I mean, it goes back to the Old Testament as well, doesn't it? They wanted you want kings? All right, you can have kings. See how you like the kings, right? Well, so it's like until a population can rule itself, somebody put in the comments, could is it possible to have a non-dogmatic Christianity? Which is a good question, which obviously I'm considering, but we could also is it possible to have a what would this be? A non-hierarchical democracy or, a participatory democracy that doesn't have rulers. Is that possible? Well, I think it is possible in small communities. Certainly not possible in nations or never mind a planet. But we're moving inexorably towards planetary organization, even if you're not a globalist. And even if if managed somehow nationalism is still rescued, or if it's restored in some way or reinitiated, then that's still beyond. There's still the scale of that is too great for participatory democracy, as in everybody just mucking in and mm, basically regulating themselves. That's the only and that's anarchy. I mean, from the state's point of view, that's anarchy, and that's the only solution that I see, and I don't see that actually happening without collapse.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the future will be and is already much more religious. I mean, I think of these are very small movements, but they are real. I mean, the religious communities are the ones who are educating themselves, having children, living in a sustainable way, and so on and so forth. Right? Obviously, there are degrees of these communities. Some of them are more or less distant and or proximate to the state. But I mean, this does seem to be, at least from the question of scale. uh, the way to manage all all of those difficult political questions. I mean, the problem comes, of course, when the government gets too excited about too many people doing that, and then inevitably, like, runs in and shoots you.
Absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
but this would then push us back to my question, which is about the extent to which one ought to, precisely because one is religious or one, desires a certain mode of being in the world, get your hands dirty to some degree, right? By discussing things or even being involved at the political level, because otherwise it's just going to be overrun by a cabal of your enemies, which it clearly is.
Yes, I mean, I'm not opposed to it, but only if it's, as I'm opposed to it for myself, but I wouldn't criticize you or anyone else for choosing that route, or who am I anyway? But on principle, I wouldn't, because it might be your unconscious ritual enactment. Like, because it's in the world and it's a physical thing, you're gonna learn things. It might be your equivalent of building a goat barn. I think it's unlikely, because I think you'll end up very frustrated and dissatisfied and disillusioned. I think I'm beyond that. Not don't have any illusions, but I don't have any illusions about reforming the world or saving communities or things like that. I'm just hoping that they don't come and take our goats away. Uh
Yeah.
so so yeah, getting one's hands dirty is essential one way or another. I think literally is better than figuratively. I think these cabals have been running things for prehistorically. I think they go back to prehistorical periods. Obviously, it's not the same individuals. It might not even be the same lineages, but the same fundamental blueprint of aggrandizers using rituals and uh, psychological operations and fear and violence, and basically the same yeah, blueprint or template for social control and networking, internationally networked. They were prehistorically as well. And as I say, I said it today already, I don't see the churches as separate from that. I suspect that those kinds of cabals were involved in Christianity from a very early stage. Oh, look, there's another thing we can use as a Trojan horse. And so these political systems that have been created post-Christianity that are nominally Christian, they're clearly useful to the cabals of social engineers. Currently, it seems that since changing images of man, that was quite explicit, we need a new myth besides Christianity. That doesn't mean that they're any more anti-Christian than the Catholic Church has been historically, with things like the Inquisition, just to use an easy example. But in the way that the Catholic Church has been involved in socio-political engineering, it's been anti-Christian. Transhumanism and wokeism and transgender and all these things that are just so horribly, so undeniably anti-Christian. It's more like, well, they're just, we've been socially engineered so much now that they can take off their skin suits a bit more and parade a bit more openly with the degeneracy, I think. But anyway, point being that these cabals, because I mean, you're talking about revolution, because a revolution always seems to lead to a similar kind of energy and agendas taking over the old ones, just because there's some, it's back to Girard, isn't it? The thing that is able to overcome a previous regime has to have um, similar kinds of drives and methods and whatnot to be successful. So it just seems always, I mean, so much this is the meaning of the Christ example to me. He overcame the world, but not sociopolitically, he didn't overcome anything. Right? And Christianity, yes, prevailed, but only because of the Roman Empire. It was useful to the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's always that kind of question of like, well, what do these cabals, whoever and however they've mutated or whatever, actually want? I mean, is it control? Is it like to massively reduce the population? Is it to eat us? Like, are we just food? Are we slaves? Are we, I mean, do you know what I mean? Like it's kind of, I mean, aren't there in fact many more like cracks in the system? I mean, I was listening to Jacob Seagal talk the other night. He's just written this book called The Information State, where he's looking at the kind of development and the history of the military and social and political use of information in the 20th and 21st century. It's an interesting book. He writes for Tablet magazine, and one thing he said is that we're going to go. He thinks into a much more um, idolatrous age, and that will be kind of moving back towards a kind of worship of um, kind of icons. One thing he said about information that was very interesting is that actually it's pretty useless as a mode of control, right? When we think about a kind of totalitarian or quasi-totalitarian collection of information, and he moves through this history of data as as like fact, and then information becomes surprise because it's about distinguishing noise from anything useful, and then it becomes kind of control. But the problem with information as control is that it's like a really quantitative model in many ways, right? So, oh, if only we have all the information, if only we surveil and track everything about everyone and we gather everything and everyone, right? And
Yeah.
it's kind of mapping, measuring thing. But this doesn't actually tell you anything about what is going to happen. It's actually kind of counterproductive for predicting behavior, particularly political behavior. If you think about the kind of Stasi project of information gathering, they couldn't see that the fall was coming. You know, that despite all of their information and so on, right? They could nevertheless not see this massive juggernaut of the end of the regime that was heading their way, right? So I'm kind of interested in this idea that there may be ways in which people are seeking to control us and mine us and asset strip us and eliminate the middle class and do all kinds of things. Um, but that it A can never be total, right? Whether it's right down to controlling what people think or how they think or when they think. Um, and there will always be massive things that they can't see, that can't be seen from the standpoint of the state, of the information state.
Mm. Well, certainly you could say that the desire for control controls people. Like, I mean, insofar as groups are trying to exercise total control over everything, they are slaves to that drive, and it probably is I mean, certainly unconscious, and it may be that it explodes at a certain point. It actually destroys itself from within because it's like this omnivorous thing that's just trying to consume everything. Maybe something like that going on. Um, and that would be metaphysical too, like some sort of satanic egregore that basically is just trying to consume everything to turn it into itself, but it can't actually contain it. It can't do it. Right. So it's really like a heroin addict that basically just consumes himself, speaking personally there. But what happens in the meantime, because a big part of the agenda, or at least the way it seems to unfold, is to lure people into, like, if the technology to control information and monitor and survey is largely dependent on us being adopters, right? We adopt it and we use it, and therefore we consent to being monitored and all the rest of it, and we provide our information. But it's a two-way thing as well, because we're more and more dependent on the tools of surveillance that are surveying us to survey each other. And so we're getting recruited into a kind of Rennick went on's reign of quantity, this sense where we become control addicts and we become information junkies, and we depend more, like transgender is a microcosm of this, that this will make you free. You're free to say who you are, but you'll be completely dependent on the state technology and the drugs, right? So basically, you're enslaving yourself far more than you ever would have been by falling for this, this false promise of freedom. It's kind of Luciferian. So I think at a much broader level, that's distributed all through the promises of the internet and the technology and the ideology. Um, that way, yeah, we believe information will set us free. and that will give it the more information, the more knowledge we can gather, the more control we can have over our lives, and so on. So I think there's something subtler, like you're defining it as an us and them thing there, which I tend to see it more as a them that's turning us into them, and so there's a shrinking us really, this real autonomous, subjective, sentient soul self that is oriented away from the herd towards total alienation and ostracization like Christ on the cross, but the real freedom that Jesus is offering. It does mean saying no to all these temptations and just sitting there in the desert for however long it takes. And that, so that kind of temptation, because I know I fall for it. It's very hard for me to see it, and yet I bang on about it every week, and I try and remind people, and I know people who see it as well. Um, and this is why I say, I'm not pessimistic because I think that it's going to work out. I don't think that most people's idea of how it could work out or what they think it would require for it to work out is realistic. As in socio-culturally, politically, or for the whole of humanity, I don't see it working out. I see it working out for God and for Christ and the Holy Spirit, and for the human form, like the image of God will survive, it will prevail. But to put it really bluntly, it could. This is in pluribus. Actually, there's one way that people say pluribus might be developing, not to product placement. I don't think it was any TV show I watched last year. It could come back to just one Adam and Eve again. Just one man and one woman survive, but isn't that enough? I mean, it would be a reset, which it wouldn't be the best thing, perhaps, but as long as there is life still, and it is. I mean, what is this global planetary consciousness thing that we're pretending to enter into, or what is it? Because it's not like a hive mind is the counterfeit, the Teilhard de Chardin. This is the counterfeit. This is the body of Antichrist, in my view, Big Mother. So then what is planetary consciousness in a true sense, as in the consciousness of Christ living in all of humanity, so that we all experience ourselves as connected together in that body? Um, what does that consist of? What would it look like? Maybe it's just, yeah, it's two or more, but then two is enough. So
Okay.
it could be a trap. It could be a trap that if we try and make more humanity, well,
I'm gonna stop you before it's a trap. We're not on that on the trap. I like I very much liked your, it just comes down to one man and one woman. I think of, like, the Cranach painting of Adam and Eve and, it's
yeah,
incredibly.
well, I wasn't gonna take that away. I was just saying if we try and save more than ourselves and our partner, let's say, and the possibility of a child as the Holy Spirit, the third, then we might lose the ball. It's about, in fact, like taking care of your own backyard, and that would be my only criticism of political activism, even as an individual thing, is it might be an easier way for some people than actually taking care of their own nearest and dearest and those immediate circumstances.
Yes, as someone whose office is a total tip, not that you can see, you could just see my books, but, I very much think that we should tidy our rooms first of all, and that cleanliness is next to godliness and all of these things, and let's just stop, like, dwelling in abstraction and absurdity and actually just put some T-shirts away. But yeah, I think we should probably wrap it up there, if only because my brain is melted and I'm just gonna get less and less
Yeah,
coherent.
you want to get back in the world and be less of the world.
Yeah, I'm gonna get every phrase wrong. I think it's revealing when we do that. Um, but yeah, so this was like an experiment to see if it would work, if me and Jason could have a live conversation with whoever wanted to listen in. So we might do some more. We probably will do some other ones. Um, it might be kind of cool if people have suggestions, if Jason is open to that.
Obviously, I am. It's always an experiment, by the way, but it's
Yeah, no, it's true.
first
But you
time.
know what I mean? Just before it becomes a ritual.
Yeah, right.
It's
Well, there's 77 eyes on us right now, according to the stats. So,
well, they're probably not really listening. Maybe some of them are just sort of like putting their clothes away like good human beings.
well, yeah,
Uh,
fine.
half listening.
Just background
Um,
hum.
but yes, it's very nice for Jason to join me, or for me to join Jason. I don't know. This didn't really belong to
Look,
either.
we're 1 hour 44 as well, which is 2 times 77, and it's 144,000. That's we only have to save 144,000.
Okay. Well, I should absolutely close the stream before it flicks over. So I'll see you again, Jason.
Yeah,
I
thanks.
hope you. And thank
Thanks.
you everyone for watching, listening. Bye.
Bye.